Smart objects offer a non-destructive and flexible way to work with layers in Photoshop, especially when you're resizing and transforming or warping layers. Let's say, for instance, that I want to make this image smaller within the canvas, but I'm not exactly sure what size it's ultimately going to end up being. So on the Layers panel, I'll convert the background into a layer by clicking on the lock icon. But if I choose the Edit menu and then select Transform and choose Scale, for example, and I grab one of the corner points and I start scaling this image down, and let's actually reposition it into the center, and let's also add a warp by clicking on the Warp icon. I'll just choose one of the presets like Arch and change the bend to maybe 10. When I apply this transformation, Photoshop throws away all of the information that it doesn't need when it resizes it down, and that's a permanent change. So if I resize this image up by choosing Edit, returning to Transform and Scale, and then holding down the Option key to scale from the center, I'll reposition it, click on Warp, and then try to remove that arch that we applied by moving the bend in the opposite direction of 10%. Well, we can see that when I apply that, I've lost a lot of image quality. The image is all blurry because when I sized it down, Photoshop threw away the information, and now that I'm sizing it up, Photoshop has to make up that information. From the History panel, I'm going to click on the initial snapshot so that we're back to the original image. This time, to avoid the loss of quality, I'm going to use a Smart Object by choosing Layer, Smart Objects, and then Convert to Smart Object. On the Layers panel, we see that I no longer have a background, but I have a Smart Object, and this is the icon that represents the Smart Object. Now, when I choose Edit, Transform, and Scale, and I'll hold down the Option key on the Mac or the Alt key on Windows to scale from the center, and then I click the Warp icon, and I apply that arch again at 10%. When I apply this transformation, Photoshop has retained all of the higher res information from that layer. So when I choose Edit and then Transform and Scale, and I click on the Warp icon, I can quickly reset the warp by clicking on this icon, and then I'll return to the Scale option by clicking on Transform, hold down the Option key on Mac or the Alt key on Windows, and scale that back up. I'll click on the check mark to apply that, and you can see we still have the high quality original information. Now there is one drawback of using Smart Objects. If you want to do pixel-based editing, for example, I might want to use the Clone tool or Paint on a layer, then I need to edit the contents of the Smart Object. I'll choose Layer, Smart Objects, and then Edit Contents. That brings up the contents of the layer in its own window. So I have two windows open now. This is the parent document that contains the Smart Object, and I have the contents of the Smart Object here as the .psb file. I'll tap the J key to select the Spot Healing Brush, and then just remove a few of these little rocks here, maybe in the foreground. And when I'm finished, I'll choose File, and then Save to save the changes. And when I select File and then Close, we can see that the contents of the Smart Object have been updated and those rocks have been edited. 3 important things to point out before we wrap up. Smart Objects will make your files larger because they're storing that extra information. So with that in mind, you might want to resize the contents of the layer down to the maximum size that you think you'll need before you convert it to a Smart Object. If you're planning on adding a layer mask to a Smart Object, you might want to convert the layer to a Smart Object before you add the layer mask. That will make it a lot easier for you to access the layer mask because you won't have to edit the contents of the Smart Object in order to make those edits. And finally, you can convert more than one layer into a single smart object, as we'll see in a later video. And we can do that in order to transform or to warp multiple layers as if they're one. So I find it can be a huge advantage to work with smart objects in Photoshop when I'm doing my multi-image composites, especially when I want the added flexibility of being able to transform and warp images multiple times in order to try different compositions without losing any image quality.